we show the world at large. And then there's the truth.
Guess I should talk about Sargon and the Liberalists. But I want to be fair, as usual, and I want to get a few things out of the way about all this first, kind of defending and giving kudos where it's due and all that. I really don't think that Sargon did as badly in the debate on Warski Stream as people think. He was there essentially to mock the far right, which he did successfully, as far as I'm concerned. And the double team of him and Styx worked really well to show the flaws and take the piss out of Spencer. So I don't think he did as badly there as people are saying. I think it's just kind of showing people's partisan lines. That said, he doesn't tend to do as well in debates as he probably should. And that's a problem. And he seems to have taken on board a lot of this criticism and beaten himself up a bit about it. But in no way has the skeptic community been sent packing or demolished or whatever else people are saying. That hasn't happened at all. I also think the criticisms of him for actually getting up and doing something, however flawed it might be, I don't think those are valid. I think that's markedly uncharitable. I often say to people that the difference between people who get things done and people who don't, the difference between people who make careers out of things they love and people who don't, is that just they try. Simply by trying, you put yourself ahead of 90% of the opposition. So I applaud Sargon for putting his money where his mouth is and trying to organise and get things done and take activism into the real world, though I think the dichotomy between real and online activism has dissolved over the years. It used to be more of a valid criticism to call someone a keyboard warrior, but these days with hashtag activism and so on being taken up by the media and so on, I think that divide is dissolving, and that what we do and say online can have a real impact. But if he wants to take it further and take it into the real world and campaign and so on, then more power to him. More people should stand up for their principles. The whole idea that individuals can't form a collective is stupid, because any collective is made up of individuals, and there's no reason people can't come together in a common cause while remaining individualists. I mean, that's the core conceit and idea behind anarchism. Not chaos, but that people come together and order themselves voluntarily in order to get things done, and that's constantly splitting and changing and moving and so on. So there's no reason why individualists can't come together to fight for the individualist cause. I mean, there are common beliefs. It's a community, just like the skeptic community is a community, no matter how much people like to pretend that it isn't, because it's people who share certain beliefs and communicate with each other and spread and share ideas, and that is what makes up a community. You don't have to agree or anything. So all of these criticisms are essentially bullshit. I should probably touch on Mr. Meteker, Jim, as people like to call him, which gets him confused with me, weirdly. Look, Meteker is a great person to have on your side during an internet slap fight, because he is really effective. But he's a man without principles, without any real moral guidance, whatever. He's essentially an internet psychopath or sociopath. He's cynical in the worst possible way. It's not a cynicism that's bred by encounters in the world or anything. He just doesn't think anything matters. It's a nihilistic cynicism. He's just here for the lulz. Should he agree with Sargon? Yes, he should. Sargon is anti-censorship. Meteker would be and is affected by censorship. The very things that Meteker needs in order to be able to do what he does, however cynical and shitty and nasty it can be to people, these are things that Sargon is defending. So they should be natural allies, but Mitakur can't step outside of his everything is shit bubble for a second to think pragmatically about the future. He just rips the shit out of everyone. That was fantastic when he was on the side of Gamergate and fighting for things that actually mattered, purely by coincidence. But these days he's just a nasty little shit, really. For all he's good at presentation and for all his voice carries well and all that, he's just a nasty bastard, really. So I wouldn't worry about him. I wouldn't bother trying to get him on board or anything. You don't need him to. Just let him do his thing. Alright, that out of the way, I do have some criticisms. Individual rights are all well and good, but just like every other political, economic and social ideology, you're going to run into an inevitable problem. Where the rights of a person to do something impact on the rights of someone to be free from something. And this is one of the central problems, I think, that exist with all political systems. You can look at Marxist state socialism and you can see an extreme version of providing freedom from. Via the state, the idea was, executed well or not, that things would be provided for everybody. So you would be free from the need to concern yourself with shelter, with food, with transit and so on. These were all dealt with collectively. So you were heavily insulated and provided with freedom from. You were taken care of. I mean, you used to be able to cross the entirety of Russia for something like $30 airfare or something. That's one extreme. The other extreme is freedom too, where you are completely unbounded by any kind of collective responsibility whatsoever. This is often what people mistake for anarchism, and it would apply to anarcho-capitalism. But it's this kind of extreme Randian side of things on the freedom too. So the classic example of this would be gun ownership. Does your freedom to own and operate a firearm count more than people's freedom from being randomly gunned down by a mass shooter, or the increased level of deadliness in crime and the need for police to be armed and so on? Where's the balance between the two? Does your freedom to hold on to all of your money and not pay any taxation, does that overcome people's freedom from illness and infirmity, where we collectively pay for health insurance and so on, or health care? You've got to strike that balance, and we're already seeing sort of divides and piss-taking of Sargon on this issue because he supports universal healthcare, which is a collectivist freedom from that impinges on freedoms too, which tend to be associated with individualism. So you've already got a problem there. You'll probably find other people in conflict who would otherwise style themselves individualists over taxation at all, or firearm ownership, or the level of regulation and control that needs to exist over corporate entities and so on. These are all divides, and these are all the same kinds of conflicts. And by emphasizing the individualist part, you are actually going to impact negatively on the freedom from rights of many individuals. So this is a conflict that needs to be resolved in some way, perhaps in the expression of policies that are supported and so on, and that's inevitably going to lead to schisms. Sargon expresses his support for democracy on the liberalist principles, but what kind of democracy? I mean, the democracy we have in the UK is deeply compromised, both by the same corporate pressures that we see in the US and many other Western nations, and by its old-fashioned and traditional nature. First past the post is desperately unrepresentative. The House of Lords is desperately unrepresentative. We're still a constitutional monarchy, for Christ's sake. there's many forms of democracy. You could have proportional representation, you could have single transferable vote. These are both more democratic, more representative. But then you start running into other problems. Do you want a government that is strong and effective, or representative? A representative system tends to produce coalition governments. Not that we've exactly been clear of those in the last few elections anyway, but yeah, that is a weakness. You're trading off effectiveness for representation. And another thing that worries me is Sargon's support for Brexit demonstrates a contempt for democracy. Now that might sound weird, but this referendum that we had, that's not democracy, that's ochlocracy, that is mob rule. Such a narrow margin is just ruled by the majority, in this case through the fear that is engendered in government that has prevented them from leading and governing. A majority of people in a position to know and to understand the issues were against Brexit. Something like two-thirds of Parliament was originally against it, but they're too cowardly to lead and to do what many of us feel is necessary in rejecting the will of the people, the extremely narrow will of the people, and doing what's right. They've turned populist. They're scared to lead. But yeah, that's the difference between ochlocracy and democracy. Democracy safeguards and looks after the rights of minorities. It's not simple majority rule. It can take many other forms. In our cases, it's representative democracy. But the idea is that you then create a political class who are supposed to be experts in their fields and in running the country, a kind of technocracy, which we don't have either, because most of the people in government don't really know anything about what they're doing. This is a problem, which means it really comes down to civil servants, mandarins, focus groups, and quangos, rather than our elected representatives anyway. So there's all these problems which aren't really being addressed. I mean, what is your vision for democracy? And is it a democracy, or is it an ochlocracy? These are things that need to be addressed more clearly, I think. Support for economic freedom is another phrase that tends to pop up red flags to me, because that tends to mean corporate freedom, which is the very thing that has led to the usurpation and undermining of democracy both in the UK and the US. It's a big problem. It also tends to mean things like lowering taxation, which leads to all kinds of social cohesion and other problems, because you're no longer investing in the community. And we know that social investment is a far more cost-effective way of increasing social mobility, of lowering crime, substance abuse, all of those things. It's way more effective than prisons and policing. Basically, if you invest in a community and you make people's lives bearable based on what they have, there's much less tendency for them to indulge in crime, antisocial behaviour, and compensatory self-coping mechanisms like drugs and alcohol. And it's way cheaper than prisons and police. So, what do you mean here? And what do you mean by a productive society? I mean, if we look at the US and UK, which probably have the most laissez-faire economic systems in the West at the moment, they also have the worst social mobility, whereas countries that engage in massive social investment, like the Scandinavian countries, there you see a lot more social mobility, because they invest in things like education, so on, and invest in people. It's far easier for people to rise through the social ranks, to transcend the class that they're born into and the poverty level that they're born into. It's far easier for them to get out of that than it is in countries like the US and UK, who have this dogmatic belief in, well, let's call it the American dream, that just simply doesn't bear out into reality, apart from a handful of very lucky individuals. But you would also argue that the Scandinavian countries, with their heavy tax rates and their large welfare states and so on, you would probably argue that they're less economically free than, say, the US and UK. And many people chafe even under the reduced safety nets and regulation that we have in the US and UK. But the positive outcomes for the individual economically and in their ability to transcend their class, these work out much better in countries which you would argue have less economic freedom. So there's a paradox there. Are you going to follow the studies and the statistics and the information and improve the lot of the individual through collective investment, or are you going to reject that and allow wealth and power to continue to accumulate in the very way that has undermined our democracies and the economic freedoms and rights of the individual, the average Joe Spod in the street? You've got a problem there too. Freedom of speech, freedom of expression, I don't see us having any major conflicts there, but you do need to have some idea of where the line is. For me, that line is harm, the harm principle. So you can say any nasty shit that you like, up to the point where you're actually, directly encouraging violence. People's discomfort doesn't count as harm under the harm principle. So you can say offensive things and so on, that should all be fine. But, where's your line? And what do we do about religious expression? I mean, gay wedding cakes. On what side of the line do you come down there? Whose rights take priority? The individual rights of the business owner to turn away or refuse service to anyone they like, or the individual rights of the people using the service to get that service without prejudice or discrimination of any kind? Where do you come down there? Or similarly, should a business be allowed to turn away black people or atheists or whatever, freckled people? Who the fuck knows? At where do you draw the line on that? On the collective right of people to have access to services, or the individual right of the business owner to run their business entirely how they like? And similarly, you've got to come to some kind of decision about regulation. How much, what level, in regard to what things are you going to apply? Beyond just free expression. But in general, on principle, we can agree. Support for self-reliance is all well and good, but it's another one of those phrases that throws up red flags. The problem with an ideal or an ideology of self-reliance is that it becomes this pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you can sort things out for yourself sort of idea. And while that can be true for people, there's lots of people who, through no fault of their own, don't succeed in our societies. And we need to have a way to deal with and help people like that. Perhaps the line of difference is that between a hand out and a hand up. Now, this has recently become a more personal issue for me because my depression, anxiety, illnesses and so on have progressed to the point where I'm trying to get state help. And it's already incredibly difficult. And I already work as much as I can on things, and it's not enough. And my illnesses prevent me from pursuing conventional employment. So what am I supposed to do in your ideal state? How am I supposed to be completely self-reliant? How am I supposed to pull myself up by my bootstraps out of that through no fault of my own? I can't do many of the things that people would suggest that you do. And I'm hardly alone. The actual amount of scroungers and malingerers is a tiny fraction of what people think it is. At least 1 year we have spent more in the UK pursuing benefit fraud than has actually been defrauded from the benefit system. At least once that's happened. So when you talk about self-reliance, I start thinking, who's going to be left behind, who's going to be hurt, what are you going to do with the people who can't make it or who need a bit of help to make it? Things like basic income, where they've been run as experiments, have helped people by giving them the breathing room to start their own businesses and things. And that might seem counterintuitive to your idea of self-reliance. all that they really needed was enough breathing room, enough extra spare money in order to create a business of their own, to start creating wealth and to start looking after themselves. So maybe that's the differential that you can make, that hand up versus a handout. But you're still gonna have people that need assistance, and what's the alternative? Letting them starve in the street like we used to, back in Dickens's day? I don't think that's a good way to go about things either. So this is yet another area that needs some clarity and thought beyond buzzwords and things that appeal to, honestly, a fairly conservative base. Blind justice, we can certainly agree on, but you need to think about the implications of this, such as should people who are accused of sex crimes, molestation, rape and so on, should their identities be kept a secret until after the trial to help protect their reputations? What do we do about things like Me Too, where social accusations are made and destroy lives and careers without being subjected to the test of the courts? And there are genuine issues around these kinds of crimes in courts. They're extremely hard to prove because really most of the time it comes down to one person's word against another. And that seems to be the basis of a lot of people's complaints and a push for an inquisitorial justice system with regard to these issues, or a lowering of the burden of proof, none of which are acceptable. But we can admit that there are issues and problems in the prosecution of these crimes, and are there any practical solutions? What can we do about it? So we need to discuss those. We need to discuss it from a sane and rational perspective, preserving people's innocent until proven guilty status, rather than succumbing to what the social justice warrior types seem to want, which is essentially burning people at the stake, or so it seems, albeit on social media, burning their reputations at the stake. There's another aspect to the justice system which isn't talked about here. Our system is supposed to be based upon blind justice. This is how it's already supposed to be, but that has been undermined. But there is another aspect to the justice system which has also been tremendously undermined. The idea of prison and correctional institutions, whatever you want to call them, as punishment was an old point of view that changed to one of rehabilitation and rescue over the course of the late 19th century through into the 20th century, and then has slipped back into one of punishment and profitability, of putting criminals to work, essentially as slave labour in the US. And in the UK, our prisons are so run down and old and Victorian that the degree of punishment has just ratcheted up and up, and successive conservative governments have taken that hard line on crime thing and have dragged the rest of the political parties after them because it's popular with the public, even though they know fuck all about criminal psychology or rehabilitation and so on. So what's your focus there? I mean, blind justice in the courts is all well and good, but what do you do once you actually have a criminal? Do you punish them, or do you try to rehabilitate and invest in them to reduce recidivism and bring them back into society to become a productive member of that society? On what side of that line do you come down on? Secularism, you'll get no argument from me on, other than you need to consider the interface between people's right to their faith and how that interacts with the public, and at what point and at what level the government should get involved in that. I think the problem that you've got here is that you've set out an activist goal, but you've written the skeletal outline of a political manifesto. If you want to do activism works much better when focused on a particular single issue or couple of issues that you can unite people across political grounds. I mean, if you look back to the beginning of the Occupy movement, that was focused on getting money out of politics, and then it broke apart once people started to bring in all kinds of other shit. If you look at Gamergate, when Gamergate was focused on ethical games journalism and corruption issues, that was extremely unifying, and it's when people started trying to bring in other things again that it kind of splintered, though it was never organised to a level that was a huge problem and people could come back together on particular issues and fight forward on them. But what you've written seems at odds with what your goal is, And there's already plenty of organisations like Fire, like Spiked, like the EFF, like the ACLU. To an extent, they've been compromised a bit. You know, there's all these groups that are already doing what your intention is to do, and who might benefit from fundraising efforts or awareness-raising exercises or whatever that you might engage in. Or you could set up your own group that's focused on this particular goal. You know, free expression seems to be the main thrust of what you're interested in, and criticisms and fighting back against the culture that is producing this new wave of censorship. And that would be a far more focused and effective goal, in my opinion, rather than setting up this kind of vague political party thing, which doesn't make a lot of sense, since a lot of your support and so on comes from overseas, and political parties are national things. So as a personal manifesto, that's great. Trying to build a movement or some activism around it is not going to work so much. I agree with some of the things that you say, and on those I will support you, but I'm not signing up to join this movement. I am still a skeptic. That is the primary thing that drives me, skepticism and pragmatism. I might ideologically be an anarchist, but my pragmatism and my skepticism leads me to think that that's not achievable, and the best thing that we have to achieve the goals that I see, and the ones that cross over with a lot of yours, is democratic socialism. So that's where I'm going to put my efforts into, and support for Europe. My activism goes into that, and also activism on free expression, sexual expression, all the rest of it. You know, I pick and choose from a buffet, a smorgasbord of issues. I'm not going to sign up with you because there's things there that concern and worry me, and I don't think the skeptic label is dead or in trouble at all. Quite honestly, I'm gonna stick with that. Though again, I applaud you for making an effort and doing this. I just don't think it's going to have the effect that you want it to. One last thing that I forgot at the beginning. Lots of people are saying that this is characteristic of Sargon's ego or whatever. I don't think that it is, and I think you're being rather unfair. A huge number of people, both opposed to Sargon and on his side, have been telling him that he's a leader, or asking him to be a leader, for a very long time. And for years, he has resisted this. I think anyone would give way eventually under the insistence of lots of people that they are somehow in charge, that they do have lots of influence, that they can use it to forward their agenda. I think anyone would give in to that eventually, and it's to Sargon's credit that he's held out against that for so long. Maybe his ego's increased a little bit, but I think it's an unfair criticism to lay at his feet. And as usual, by being moderate and considered and rational and skeptical, everyone's gonna hate me. Zang.